The new airline captured the support of the small cities and large towns of New Zealand. The enthusiasm of staff and the extra attention they gave to passengers was crystallised by the phrase, the delicate art of spansmanship. And it was this delicate art that differentiated the airline from all others. SPANZ introduced things we now take for granted: in-flight meals, cut rates on night flights, even just addressing passengers by their own names.
We had a list of passengers, and the more friendly we were, and so by trying to memorise all the names and getting to know people, we had friendly passengers that flew with us, because they were, you know, people that flying was relatively new to most people in those days. They were nervous, so they liked the friendly approach, the touch of it, you know. It was a more personal flight.
There was such a wonderful feeling in the staff of doing something that they wanted to do. They were all keen, prepared to work long hours, and go that bit extra. Quite different to working into a government monopoly, where we didn't feel your efforts might be appreciated. So that, flying somewhere in those days in a DC-3, you didn't have a cabin attendant until the late 50s. And then you might get a barley sugar. Well, we changed all that. We gave them a cup of tea, or we gave them a bottle of champers or something, then changed it altogether. And we were keen about telling people there's more to flying than just sitting there eating barley sugar.
Rex Daniel was an NAC pilot with World War II service in bombers and transport. For him, the celebrations have been a chance to again travel New Zealand with an old and very close friend, the other co-founder of SPANZ, Bob Anderson. Bob too had Air Force experience, as well as being another NAC pilot. Bob and Rex are quick to say that this airline belonged to New Zealand, but in fact it was created by their vision and their energy.
Our thought was around tourism. I felt that New Zealand's a beautiful country to see from the air. We weren't showing it off to advantage. And tourism in those days was almost a dirty word. It wasn't popular. I recall in the Air Service licence hearing we had Jack Bush, who was then General Manager of NAC, saying, "We're a scheduled airline, we're not a tourist airline." They weren't interested. Tourism hadn't hit New Zealand as a viable proposition.
It was not about competing with NAC at all. It was all about forming a route structure that would carry tourists. And we thought it would be reasonably easy to generate overseas tourists. And for the fact that we never really got to generate overseas tourists. But the concept was to fly these low-density routes with the cabin load being augmented by overseas passengers who were having a look-see at New Zealand. But that took a lot of organisation, and instead of getting in contact with all the overseas airlines and agents that it needed to, the sort of sales work that had to be done, we were all the time traipsing up and down to Wellington when we should have been out selling the airline. And I believe that was a big factor in that. We really never generated overseas tourists in any volume.
New Zealand's passenger services were dominated by the state-owned NAC, National Airways Corporation. NAC had 5 Friendships, 3 Viscounts and 22 DC-3s. SPANZ had just 2 DC-3s. There seemed to be no competition. NAC was an experienced modern operation. A competitor needed to be ambitious.
First sales manager was working for Union Airways, and he happened to be looking after my children in Auckland. And he was a junior clerk virtually in Union Airways. I said, "How would you like to be sales supervisor of a new airline?" And he became the sales supervisor, and just like that. And he only had clerical experience, but he knew the game well. He'd been trained in Invercargill, we had to get an engineering manager, and he had to build up something. Bob was recruiting pilots. I was trying to recruit staff. You know, there was just nobody and no money, because until the company floated, we couldn't get any money out of anybody. We had to negotiate an overdraft before we could get any cash. So it was a very hectic period.
They really put their heart and soul into it, and that was the success of SPANZ. The enthusiasm of the crews reflected through to the passengers, the hostesses, and that they did a terrific job. And you know, I'm sure our hostesses carried the day for us in the early part.
40 years later, and the party goes on. SPANZ staff, their families, their friends, flew again to visit the cities and towns they served so well. This time, though, they had to use the DC-3s that are owned by other companies. The Christchurch-based Pioneer aircraft is used for sightseeing and charters. Ironically, they also had to use a DC-3 that's been painted up in the colours of NAC. The third aircraft to join the party was from Auckland's Warbirds collection, painted in the colours of Rex Daniels' own plane on D-Day when he towed gliders into Europe. The planes came from Australia's Ansett Airlines. Reg Ansett had paid for his shareholding in SPANZ with aircraft and parts. But there were another 800 shareholders, New Zealanders from towns and small cities. Typically they owned about 200 of the 5 shilling shares. Many felt aggrieved by the lack of NAC service. No wonder then that they flocked to SPANZ.
I recall the first morning out of Auckland, we didn't have any check-in counter, I don't think, and we had scales under the wing, and we weighed the people's bags under the wing as we put them in the luggage locker. It was a bit of a shambles, and we really realised that we had to have a more organisation than that. But it was a learning curve right from the very beginning on how we were handling customers and baggage. Baggage particularly, customs were easier than the bags.
Masterton was high on the list of airfields to be visited by the SPANZ supporters. In 1960, until SPANZ came along, there had been no regular airline services here. There was a large regional population, and Masterton, after Auckland, became the biggest centre of SPANZ shareholders. When SPANZ closed down, NAC took over the Masterton services. SPANZ had proven that the services could be viable. No wonder then that this aerodrome put on its own display for the visitors. At the small cities like Masterton, the DC-3s pulled the crowds. But in the main centres, the DC-3s jostled with the modern Viscounts and friendships of NAC. SPANZ had considered modern aircraft, but their final choice was inevitable.
The problem that we had, if you understand, at those years, I think there were still only 3 night-flying aircraft in airports in New Zealand. Like Auckland, Parabram and Harewood or Christchurch, with Oaxaca as an alternate military base. And all the other fields were really grass. And the CAA ruled that they wouldn't allow a tricycle to land on grass because it would rut the ground, and when you land across it, you get damage done to the aircraft. So while we could have looked for other aircraft, we were pretty well limited when we looked at it to DC-3s. And the Viewmaster was such a beautiful aircraft when it came out of Ansett workshops. That it stole the show, really. The aircraft themselves were beautiful inside, and the paint scheme was noticeable, and the girls did a terrific job inside the cabin, and the blokes were enthusiastic.
We were surprised when we saw them. They did a fine job. They totally refurbished them inside, and they were very nice to ride in. Very restful colour scheme, and the big windows, because we sold them like crazy, and we just set about making people interested in looking out the window. And some of them were quite astounded about this. Well, I remember Bob taking a load of Americans out of Rotorua on one occasion, and I was a passenger, and I suppose there were 22 Americans, and before they got off the ground they were all reading a book. Yeah, they weren't interested in what was outside. There was bad weather anyway. So Bob surprised them by picking up the mic and saying, sorry, there's no airfields open in North Island at the moment, so we're not too sure where we're taking you, but things are going nicely, enjoy the ride. So the Americans started to sit up and take an interest in it.
Another city to benefit from SPANZ was Timaru. As in Masterton, Timaru people fondly remembered the airline. Here, the SPANZ team was taken away to a much-honoured spot.
As the years are going on, I think that New Zealanders are becoming a lot more proud of our heritage in general, and the reality of the achievements of this particular gentleman, who all those years ago worked away on his own with no financial support from any organisation or institution, rode up and down the road on his push bike and so forth to get the parts, to hand make the parts, and a hard-working farmer at the same time.
This is the site where Richard Pearce made his first flights 100 years ago, and those flights are still being reenacted today. These people from SPANZ love to party, and they deserve to. Their impact on New Zealand aviation has been substantial.
Well, I think the positive effects of SPANZ, when you look back, the gift of hindsight, I think, yes, there was an impact on NAC in terms of the customer service, the nature of the DC-3s, of course. The NAC DC-3s were pretty much the same as they were in the late 40s. Small windows, dark interiors, uncomfortable seats. And the Viewmasters just blew them away. Beautiful colours, big windows, nice carpet. And so they had to think about renovating their DC-3s for the last period they'd be in service. So they developed the Skyliner, which was launched in early 1963.
Well, here's the first one, Airlines. 2 more still to come. The others are coming through now as we look towards the north area.
In their recent tour, the SPANZ supporters dropped in at a large South Island town that had been fiercely loyal in the 1960s. The town was Oamaru. 40 years on, and there was a new generation to welcome the visitors, but the affection and respect was still there.
As I passed through Marston, I happened to note that when we used to come through here in Marston, Alexandria, there are all grass paddocks. No runways, no landing lights, no aids to help you get in and out of the place. Nowadays we find that you've got a nice sealed runway, we've got landing lights on it, but no airlines. So that's progress of some sort, I'm sure.
The first time a SPANZ DC-3 flew into Oamaru, the then Mayor, Bill Laney, remarked, "We probably only own a couple of rivets in that plane, but we feel as though she belongs to us."
The Oamaru people contributed enthusiastically towards the establishing of the SPANZ service here in Oamaru.
So there is a good deal of Oamaru money invested in SPANZ?
Yes, there is a good deal of money, Oamaru money invested in SPANZ, but I would point out that the shareholders here went into it with the spirit of getting the air service which they wanted, which they felt was to the good of Oamaru, and a good many people contributed in a small way, and they contributed not to make money out of it, but rather that we should have the service.
If SPANZ have to pull out and can't continue this service, will Oamaru's airport cease to operate? Will you lose money?
Well, yes, we will lose the money that we've invested in SPANZ, but that won't worry us so much as the loss of SPANZ. We've come to appreciate the very fine service which SPANZ give us.
The current mayor, Duncan Taylor, is still enthusiastic about SPANZ's contribution to the town. And the town fondly remembers the air hostess who collected fresh produce from each town as she went.
When you went off to Alexandria, you could have apricots and cherries. And when you went off to Oamaru, you could load up with good North Otago spuds. And we have a present for Elaine Campbell. And I'm going to ask my wife to present it to her, a box of spuds.
And then, of course, there are the DC-3s. They excited people in 1960, and they still excite people. Perhaps best summed up by one of the 23 Americans in the supporters team.
I love airplanes. This is one of the most historic planes anywhere in the world. And what's particularly ironic is that as an American, I've got to come all the way to New Zealand to fly on a DC-3. You just can't do this in the States anymore. But it's just an amazing airplane. It was the first plane to ever serve as Air Force One in the United States, and it was the first commercial plane to ever make money commercially in the United States. So the plane's got one heck of a history.
The support from small-town New Zealand was incredible. But despite that, SPANZ was struggling. The cost of servicing loans and of paying airport and airways dues was staggering. Rex Daniel was back and forth to Wellington, questioning the bills, arguing with cabinet ministers, asking for loans. The directors considered expanding, flying the main trunk routes, buying bigger aircraft. But they faced growing opposition from the government and growing debt.
Well, I suppose there wasn't the revenue that we were looking for. The continual bickering and fighting the trips to Wellington took their toll and took the effort that you had to sort of working on the sidelines rather than operating the aircraft became pretty excessive, particularly for Rex. And so his major time was taking up on this political background rather than getting on with the job.
We were so inhibited from trying to develop these side routes that we thought, well, let's get into bed on the trunk routes and start to make some money, And we could have done it. We had 100 seaters. 100 seaters we could have undersold NAC away underneath them, and we could have leased them from Ansett. He had the DC-6Bs ready. There was a bit of a reaction from how we were getting. We didn't feel we were getting a fair crack of the whip on the small routes we were trying to service, because we were deliberately giving away from the trunk route. We said that right from the beginning. We are not here to compete with NAC. We're here to develop a tourist structure which will feed on to NAC and they can feed on to us. It's complementary. It was never set up as a competitor to NAC. The press made it that. And as soon as Ansett came in, it became a big deal that we were number one competitor in NAC. That's not how it all started at all.
I felt that we tried hard, that we fought the hard battle, we played it fair, and we were beaten. It's like a game of bowls or cricket or anything else. When you're fighting all the time, one bloke's going to win.
I can remember particularly getting to Rotorua, and we were greeted there with beautiful bouquets of flowers. We had champagne. And it was sad because it was like losing a part of a very happy family, and that's what it had been.
Of the 3 DC-3s owned by SPANZ, the original 2 went to Air America in Southeast Asia. The third went to NAC. Rex Daniel took up a job offer with Ansett in Australia. Bob Anderson went back to NAC. It was Bob who flew the last flights, thanking those who'd been so loyal.
There was no form of criticism of what we'd done. It was all support for what we had done. That they weren't too sure. NAC at that stage said they were carrying on the services, and of course they did through like Taupo, Wakatani and those places. But there was real sadness from the people that it was almost like, I suppose, like a funeral in a way, but it was pleasant. At Oamaru, when we came through, they had a lone piper who played the lament as we left. Alexander had a brass band out for us. There were farewells all the way. It was a terrific experience. In fact, I was pleased that Jenny Shepherd was with me, and we shared, the two flights, the first and the last. But overall, it was a reflection on the work the staff had done, the crews, particularly the hostesses and the pilots, because they were the ones that faced the public all the time. And there was no, I didn't feel regret. I felt, sorrow because the job was finishing, but it was a wonderful experience all the way around.
Well, SPANZ right from the start were on about tourism, and that was really very significant. And they wanted to partner with Ansett in Australia. In fact, Ansett endeavoured to get permission with these turboprop Electras to bring Australians over, then for SPANZ to run on their routes. And that was in effect stopped by Teal, by NAC and by Mount Cook. So SPANZ were up against it. The idea was a good one, and of course in future years the growth in tourism numbers, they were on the right area. It was just they were perhaps a little ahead of their time.
Yeah, New Zealand was so socialistic in the 50s that people have forgotten. And Bob and I were somehow or other, we were restless under that monopoly system. We felt there was a better way. So that, I think that the legacy, if we left one, was that changed, and that a small group can do something.